The rain came into Netherwell sideways that January, the way it always did when the fen wind found the gap in the hills, and it brought with it the smell of wet wool and tallow smoke, and the particular must of old paper that hung about the vestry, no matter how many fires Reverend Tilling lit against it. Hester Combe knew that smell better than she knew her own hands. She had grown up inside it. She was the kind of woman a village looked past without quite seeing. 26 years old, plain-faced, narrow in the shoulder, the daughter of a curate who had died poor and left her poorer. And if you had asked anyone in Netherwell to describe her, they would have said only that she kept the register very neatly and never asked for anything. She lived above the old sexton's shed at the edge of the churchyard, in 2 rooms that took the damp from the ground and gave it back at night as cold. She mended linen for the rectory and copied deeds for the steward at Calder Hall when there was copying to be had, and she kept the parish register for Reverend Tilling, who was 71 and could no longer see well enough to read his own hand, let alone the crabbed Latin of the older entries. Her father had taught her that Latin before he died, the way another father might teach a daughter to keep bees or bake bread, patiently, over years, by candlelight, because it was the one inheritance he had that could not be sold for his debts. She had his fine, steady hand too, small and upright, the kind that did not blot. It was not a woman's accomplishment. Nobody in Netherwell thought much of it. It fed her exactly as much as her needle did, which was to say barely, and she did not complain of that either. The register itself was a fat, calf-bound book, its spine cracked and re-stitched twice, once by her father and once by her, with wax thread that had darkened over the years to the colour of the boards. It went back to the reign of the 2nd George. It held every christening, every marriage, every burial in the parish for 140 years, in Latin until her grandfather's time, and in English after. And Hester had come to think of it the way another woman might think of a cradle or a hearth. It was the one thing in her narrow life that could not be taken from her by anyone with more money, because no one else in the parish could read it. She did not know that wet January, that before the year turned again, the whole of the dukedom of Calderley would come to rest on whether her hand and her Latin could be trusted. She did not know that a man was already riding toward Netherwell in a plain coat with a false name in his mouth, sent by no one but his own suspicion to find out exactly that. She only knew that the porch of the church had a broken hinge on its outer door, and that Reverend Tilling's cough was worse, and that she had 4 shillings to last her to Lady Day. She was crossing the churchyard on the Thursday before Candlemas, her shawl pulled over her cap against the sleet, when she heard it. A small sound, not quite a cry. She had heard enough sick children in Netherwell to know the difference between a child crying for attention and a child too far gone in fever to cry properly at all. This was the second kind. He was curled in the angle of the porch wall, where the broken hinge let the wind through least. A boy of perhaps 8, in a coat too thin for the season, and boots that had given up being boots some time before. His face was flushed and slack. His breath came high and quick. She knelt without thinking about her skirts in the wet stone, and put her bare hand to his forehead and felt the heat of him come up through her palm like something alive. She did not go for help first. She thought of it, and then she thought of how long help would take to come,
and she did not go for it. She got her arms under him instead and carried him herself, across the churchyard and up the outside stair to her own 2 cold rooms. And she was not a strong woman, and he was not a light boy, and by the time she had him on her own pallet, by her own small fire, she was shaking with the effort of it, and did not stop to notice. She built up the fire with wood she could not spare. She spooned broth into him a swallow at a time, though there was not much broth to spare either, and gave him the whole of her own bread when he could keep nothing else down, and sat up through that night and the next, with a wet cloth for his brow, because she had heard that fever broken too fast was worse than fever let run its course slow, though she was not entirely certain that was true, and had no one to ask. She learned his name by the 2nd day, when he was well enough to say it. Toby. No surname that meant anything, or none he would give her. His mother was dead of the same low fever 2 winters back. His father had been taken up on a poaching charge the summer before, on the word of a gamekeeper who had reasons of his own to want him gone, and transported. And Toby had been sleeping in church porches and hedgerows ever since, because the parish did not want the expense of him, and the workhouse at Fenbridge was 3 days' walk, and he had heard enough of it to be afraid. On the 3rd night, past midnight, with the boy's fever finally breaking into a clean sweat, and her own bread gone, and her own coal nearly gone with it, Hester sat by the fire, and did not think that anyone was watching her. The lane below her window was empty, the church was dark. She believed herself entirely alone, with a sick child and a dying fire. And that was precisely why she did what she did next, without artifice, without performance, without a single thought for how it might look to any eye but her own. She took the shilling she had been saving toward the mending of her own boot, the last coin she had in the world that was not already promised to bread, and she sent it the next morning with the miller's boy to fetch the surgeon from Fenbridge. And when the surgeon came and looked at her rooms and asked who would pay him, she said she would, and did not tell him it was the whole of what she had. She did not know then that a man had stood the 3rd night in the shadow of the lime tree across the lane, in a plain dark coat, with his collar turned up against the sleet, and had watched her carry the firewood in with her own arms rather than wake the boy, and had watched the candle burn at her window until near dawn, and had gone away before first light without once making himself known. She did not know that his name was not the one that would presently be given to her at the rectory door. She did not know that he had come to Netherwell for the sake of a book, and had found, instead, something he had stopped expecting to find in anyone. Reverend Tilling's cough kept him abed the whole of that week, so it was his housekeeper who answered the knock on the Friday and came to fetch Hester with the news that a gentleman had called, a Mr. Barlow, on business of the register, sent down by the estate to look over the old entries for some matter of the stewards. Hester came from Toby's bedside with her sleeves still rolled and her hands still red from wringing cloths, and found in the rectory parlor a man, perhaps 35, not handsome in any way a ballroom would have remarked on, broad through the shoulder, with a face that looked as though it had been left out in weather for some years, and a pair of eyes the brown of strong tea, watchful in a way that made her feel, absurdly, that she was the one being examined rather than the register. He did not offer his hand. He inclined his head instead, plainly, the way a tradesman might to another tradesman, and said only that he had been sent to look over the parish records, touching certain marriages of the last 30 years, on behalf of parties who wished the entries confirmed. He did not say which parties. She did not ask. It was not her place to ask, and she had learned young that questions above her station were rarely welcomed and never answered. She fetched the register herself, both arms wrapped around its weight, and set it before him on Tilling's table, and stood back the way she always stood back, because it was not hers, whatever she felt for it. He did not open it at once. He looked at her hands instead, at the ink stained into the creases of her fingers that no amount of scrubbing had ever got out. And he said, "You keep this yourself."
The Reverend's eyes are failing him, sir. And yours are not.
"No, sir." He opened the book then, and turned the pages with a care she had rarely seen a stranger take with anything, and she watched him read Latin the way a man reads something he already half knows, testing it rather than learning it, and she thought, without meaning to think it, that whoever this Mr. Barlow was, he had been taught by someone who loved the language, the way her own father had. He came back the following week, and the week after that, always with some new pretext of copying, always paying her a fee for her time that was more than fair, and that she tried twice to refuse, and was twice told, in a voice that did not invite a third attempt, that the work was worth what he offered for it, and she was not to insult him by arguing it. She did not know that this was the whole of what he had, that reasonable payment for honest work, because he had already made up his mind that he would not put her in his debt with charity she had not asked for. She only knew that Toby's surgeon's account came back from Fenbridge the following month marked "paid in full," and that when she went to the surgeon to ask who had settled it, meaning to work off whatever remained, she was told only that a gentleman had called and left the money, and asked that his name not be given, and had seemed, the surgeon said, faintly amused that she would ask. She thought of Mr. Barlow. She could not think why she thought of him, except that it was the shape of the thing, a kindness that wanted no credit, and it fit him the way her father's old coat had fit her father, without needing to be remarked on. She did not know then that the man she called Mr. Barlow had, in fact, paid a great many things in Netherwell over the preceding 2 years, without his name once attaching to any of them, and that the surgeon's amusement had been at recognizing, yet again, the same unnamed hand. By March, the work between them had settled into something like a rhythm, an hour or two of afternoons in Tilling's parlor, with the register open between them, her reading the older Latin entries aloud, while he checked them against papers of his own, that he never quite let her see the whole of, and she found, to her own faint surprise, that she was not afraid of him the way she had first been. He was not a man who talked to fill silence. He would go a quarter of an hour without a word, and she had learned not to find it uncomfortable, because when he did speak, it was always to the point, and often it was dry enough to catch her off guard into something close to a laugh, which she did not do easily, and which seemed, each time it happened, to please him more than a man ought to be pleased by so small a thing. "You read that entry wrong," he told her once, of a marriage recorded in her grandfather's day. "It says the license came with consent of the ordinary, not without." "I read it as written, sir." "Then it was written wrong, and you have found me in error 200 years old. Well done." "I did nothing but read, sir." "That," he said, "is rather the point of you." She did not understand him fully then. She understood him well enough to flush, and to bend her head back to the page, and to notice that her hands, for once, were not entirely steady on the binding, though she gave no other sign of it. He asked her once, carefully, without seeming to press, how the boy did. She told him Toby was mending, that he had taken to sweeping the church steps for pennies, though no one had asked it of him, that he slept now in the shed behind her rooms, because Tilling would not have him in the churchyard through another winter, and she would not have him nowhere at all.
Mr. Barlow listened to all of this without comment, and only said, at the end of it, that a boy who swept steps unasked was worth more to the parish than most men who waited to be asked twice. And there was something in the way he said it that told her he was not speaking only of Toby. "You did not have to take him in," he said. "You had nothing to spare." "No one else would have him, sir." "That is not an answer to what I asked." She considered this. "I would have done it for anyone," she said. "It was not a kindness. It was only what wanted doing." He looked at her for what felt, to her, an uncomfortably long moment, and said nothing further on it, and she thought she had said something wrong, though she could not think what. She did not know then that this was the exact answer he had crossed 3 counties in a false name to hear, and that a man who had spent 2 years since his father's death being courted for his title and avoided for his grief, had not, in all that time, heard anyone say a true thing so plainly and expect nothing back for it. The first she heard of Mr. Simon Marchmont was a letter to Reverend Tilling, read aloud to her because the old man's eyes could not manage it, demanding in cold, formal language that the parish register of Netherwell be produced for his inspection at Calder Hall, as a matter, the letter said, touching the settlement of the estate. Tilling grumbled that it was not for cousins of dukes to command the movement of parish books as though they were ledgers of trade, but he was old, and his living depended on the goodwill of whoever held Calder Hall, and he did not refuse outright. He asked only for time, and got a second letter, colder than the first, in reply. Hester did not think much of it beyond the ordinary unease any poor woman feels when the great take notice of something she has care of. She had the register bound at both ends with waxed thread her father had shown her how to knot, so it would not come loose again, and she kept it, as she always had, under her own eye, and told herself that a man who wrote such letters could have no real business with a book of christenings and burials that concerned, so far as she knew, nobody living. She did not know that Mr. Simon Marchmont was first cousin to the young Duke of Calderley, and stood, by an old and disputed reading of the succession, one broken marriage license away from the title itself, and that the marriage in question, entered 33 years before in this very register, by a curate long dead, was the one thing standing between him and everything he believed the world owed him. It was the last week of March, with the fen still bare and the wind still raw off the water, that Mr. Marchmont came to Netherwell in person, in a carriage too fine for the lane it travelled, and found Hester in the churchyard with the register under her arm, on her way to Tilling's parlour for the afternoon's work. He did not dismount at once. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he intends to have moved out of his path, and when he did step down, he came near enough that she had to tip her head back to meet his eye, which she did, because she had never yet found it useful to look away from anyone. "You are the woman who keeps the book," he said. "I am, sir." A curate's drudge with ink on her fingers, presuming to hold the parish record of a dukedom in her own 2 hands, as though she were fit to judge what is written there. He said it lightly, almost pleasantly, the way a man remarks on weather, and there was a small dry laugh under it, 3 practiced beats, that told her he had used the line before and found it served him well. "Tell me, does the Reverend know you cannot be trusted to leave well enough alone?" I have altered nothing, sir. I did not say you had. I said you cannot be trusted. There is a difference, and I imagine a woman of your station has not been taught it. She did not answer that at once. She held the register a little tighter against her side, and she noticed that her hands, though they wanted very much to shake, did not, and she found some small, cold comfort in that. Fair is not the same as kind, she said at last.
You have been neither to me, sir, and I have done you no injury that I know of. If you have business with the register, I will show it you gladly. I have nothing in it to hide.
Everyone has something to hide, Marchmont said. It is only a question of whether anyone has troubled to look. He did not stay to argue further. He looked once at the book under her arm as though he would like to take it from her by main force, and thought better of the picture it would make, and got back into his carriage and was gone before Tilling's housekeeper had finished crossing the yard to see what the commotion was. Hester stood a while after the carriage had gone, in the cold, with the register held against her, and a rook called once from the yew by the lich gate, the only sound in the whole raw afternoon, and she found that her eyes stung, though she did not let them fall, because she had long since taught herself not to cry where it showed. Mr. Barlow came the following day, and found her quieter than her custom, and when he asked her plainly what had happened, in a voice that gave her no room to say it was nothing, she told him, word for word, as near as she could recall it, because she had found by then that lying to him cost her more than telling him the truth ever had. He did not speak for a long moment when she had finished. His jaw had gone tight in a way she had not seen it go before, and when he did speak it was very quiet. He called you a drudge. Among other things, sir. He is wrong, Mr. Barlow said, in every particular that matters. And something in the flatness of it, the sheer certainty, settled her more than any warmer comfort could have done. She did not know then that the man who had said it held, in law and blood, more claim to judge the worth of Simon Marchmont's opinion than any man in the kingdom save the Duke himself, because he was, in point of fact, the Duke himself, and that Simon Marchmont's whole design against him rested on proving that this very register, in this very woman's keeping, could not be trusted to say what it plainly said. The accusation came within the fortnight, delivered not by Marchmont himself, but by a solicitor's clerk who arrived at the rectory with a paper for Reverend Tilling to sign, alleging that irregularities had been discovered in the parish register of Netherwell, that certain entries bore signs of recent interference, and that the woman entrusted with the book's keeping ought, in the interest of the estate's settlement, to be relieved of that charge pending inquiry. Tilling wept over it, an old man's helpless tears, and told her he did not believe a word of it, and signed the paper anyway, because his living was not his own to risk, and he had told her so with such shame in his voice that she had found herself comforting him rather than the reverse. "I have altered nothing," she told him, and it was true, and being true did not help her in the smallest degree. She surrendered the register the same afternoon into the hands of the solicitor's clerk, who took it without meeting her eye, and she went back to her cold rooms above the shed and sat a long while with her hands in her lap, looking at the ink that would not wash out of them, and thought that perhaps Marchmont had been right after all, that a woman of her station ought to have learned there was no arguing fairness with the great, only enduring them. She wrote to Mr. Barlow that same night, by candlelight, in the small, steady hand her father had given her, and told him she thought it best he found some other copyist for whatever work remained,
that her name was now attached to a charge that could do him no good to be seen near, and that she released him from any further obligation of the fee owed her, wanting nothing more than to be forgotten in the matter as quickly and quietly as possible. She did not send for Toby to be sent away. That much she held on to. Whatever else was taken from her, she would not surrender the boy. And she told Reverend Tilling so in words plain enough to end the conversation. It was Mrs. Pruitt, housekeeper of Calder Hall these 30 years, who found her 3 days later, having walked the 2 miles from the hall in a wind that cut through wool like a blade, to say that her mistress, the register, had asked to see her, which was a strange enough way to put it that Hester followed her without argument, too tired to do otherwise.
Mrs. Pruitt was a broad, dry, capable woman, with a face that gave away exactly as much as she wished, and not a scrap more. And she took Hester into her own small parlour off the kitchens, sat her by the fire, put a cup of something hot into her ink-stained hands, and said, without preamble, "You've been writing letters releasing gentlemen from obligations they never asked to be released from." "I did not think it fair to keep him bound to a scandal not his own, Mrs. Pruitt." "No," said Mrs. Pruitt. "You would think that. It is exactly the sort of thing you would think." She sat herself down opposite and folded her hands and looked at Hester a long moment before she went on. "You had better know now what you have been too plain-headed to guess, girl, before you do something further out of misplaced kindness. Mr. Barlow is not a copyist sent down from the estate. Mr. Barlow is the Duke of Calderley. He has been Mr. Barlow to you because he wished to know, before he told you otherwise, whether the woman keeping his family's register was worth trusting with the whole truth of who came asking after it." Hester set the cup down very carefully, because her hand had begun, for the first time in weeks, to shake, and she did not want it seen. "It was his own money paid the surgeon at Fenbridge for your boy. It was his own hand that stopped Mr. Marchmont laying claim to that register 2 years past, before ever you came to keep it, when Marchmont first tried to have it removed to his own house for safe keeping, as he called it. It was his own quiet arrangement that settled your late father's debts to the miller and the chandler within a month of his dying, though you never knew where that mercy came from, and I dare say never thought to ask. He does not put his name to a kindness, girl. He never has. It is the one vanity he allows himself, to be thanked by no one." Hester sat very still with this, the fire popping once in the grate, and found that what she felt was not anger at having been deceived, though she knew she was entitled to some measure of it, but something closer to grief for how long she had misread plain coldness for coincidence, when it had been, the whole time, a kind of devotion she had no name for. "Why," she said at last, "does he need the register at all, if he is already the Duke?" Mrs. Pruitt's face did something complicated. "Because Mr. Marchmont means to prove the old Duke's marriage void," she said. "Your master's parents were married in this parish 30 years since, quietly, and not in London, for reasons that were nobody's business but their own. Mr. Marchmont says the curate who married them lacked the bishop's proper license, and that if the marriage was void, then his grace is base-born, and the title falls to Mr. Marchmont instead. He has been trying to prove it, or, failing that, to make it look as though the register that would prove him wrong has been tampered with by someone convenient to blame. You, my dear, have been convenient." The Duke came to her himself the following evening, at the shed behind the sexton's rooms where Toby now slept sound and safe, and he did not send word ahead.
And when she opened her door to him, she found him standing in the last of the light, with his hat in his hands, like a man come to confess something too large for standing on ceremony. "May I come in?" he said. "Or would you rather I said it here in the cold, where I dare say I have earned the privilege of standing?" She let him in. The room was small and warm from the fire she had banked for Toby, and it smelled of wood smoke and the dried lavender she kept against the damp. And he stood in the middle of it looking, for the first time since she had known him, entirely uncertain of himself. "My name is not Barlow," he said. "It never was. I am Nathaniel Marchmont, Duke of Calderley, and I came to Netherwell in a false coat and a false name, because my cousin means to take from me everything my father left, on the strength of a claim that only your register and your honesty in reading it can answer. I did not know, when I first came, whether the woman who kept that book could be trusted with the truth of what hung on it. I did not know you at all. I only knew that I could not risk asking outright, because a woman told the whole truth of the stakes might be tempted, however honest, to see what she wished to see in an old man's Latin. I wanted to know what you did, and what you were, when you believed no lord of any consequence was watching you. That is the only test that tells the truth of a person. Every other kind can be prepared for." She said nothing for a moment. The fire popped. Somewhere outside a rook called, late for the hour, one flat note into the dark. "You watched me," she said slowly, "the night I took the boy in." "I did." "You said nothing." There was nothing that night that wanted my saying anything. There was only a woman giving away her last coin and her last loaf to a child who could never repay her, believing herself entirely alone in it. I have known a great many people since my father died who wished to be seen being good to me. I had never yet met one who was good to a stranger, for no other witness but herself. He turned his hat once in his hands. "I have deceived you for 3 months under a name that was not mine, and I have let you believe a great many small unkindnesses were coincidence, when they were, in fact, my own doing, badly disguised. I do not ask you to forgive that tonight. I ask only that you know the whole of it, so that whatever you decide of me, you decide it with the truth in your hand, and not the half of it." "Why tell me it all?" she said. "You might have let it lie. You might have let Marchmont's charge stand, and found some other way to clear the register without ever owning what you'd done." "Because I find," he said, and here, for the only time she ever saw it, his voice was not entirely steady, "that I would rather you knew the whole truth of me, and refused me for it, than have your good opinion on the strength of a lie I let stand a day longer than I had to. I do not want your gratitude, Miss Combe. I have watched what gratitude does to you, and I do not want it. I want only your honesty, which you have given me without knowing you gave it every day since January, and which I have not yet earned the right to ask for again." She looked at his hands, turning the hat, not quite steady either, and found some strange comfort in that a duke's hands could shake as plainly as her own. "What is it you want of me, your grace?" she said, "now that I know who asks it." "Nothing tonight," he said. "I have a hearing to face before the bishop in a fortnight's time, at which my cousin means to prove me no true duke at all. And I would have your register and your Latin and your honest reading of both, if you are willing to give them, because no one else alive can answer him as you can. Beyond that I ask nothing, not tonight, and not at the hearing's end either, unless you wish it asked.
I would rather have your no freely given than a yes given only because you believed you owed it to a man who once wore a false name in your parlour. She thought of Marchmont's laugh, 3 practised beats, and of the register taken out of her hands into a stranger's, and of a boy sleeping sound in the next room because a duke had paid a surgeon and asked not to be thanked for it. And she said, "Then let us begin with the register, your grace, and see what else there is time to ask after." He almost smiled at that, an unpracticed thing, gone as soon as it came, and she found she had wanted, more than she knew how to say, to be the one who put it there. The hearing was held at Calder Hall itself, in the long gallery, because the Bishop of Rothmere had ruled that a matter touching a parish register was properly heard where the register's authenticity could be examined alongside the diocesan licence rolls the bishop's own clerk had brought down from the cathedral archive. It was the 1st of June, warm at last, the long windows standing open to a garden thick with the smell of cut grass and roses coming into bloom, and the gallery was fuller than Hester had ever seen any room in her life. Estate tenants and county gentry and the Duke's own solicitors ranged along the walls to hear a dispute that would settle who among 2 cousins owned the roof over all their heads. Simon Marchmont stood before the bishop's table with the confidence of a man who had rehearsed his triumph 100 times in private, and when his moment came, he did not trouble to speak first in English at all. He addressed himself directly to the bishop, in Latin, fluent and cold, laying out the canon rule as he had it prepared, that a marriage solemnized without the ordinary's licence was void from its beginning. Matrimonium sine licentia episcopi, ab initio nullum est, and that the register of Netherwell, on its face, recorded no such licence for the marriage of the old Duke's parents 30 years before, and that therefore, my Lord Bishop, there was no true Duke of Calderley sitting in this room, only a natural son with no more claim to the title than any tenant at the gate. He said it beautifully. He said it, Hester thought, watching him, the way a man says something he has said before and found always won him the room. And there was a small ripple of unease along the gallery walls, because half the gentry present had enough schoolroom Latin to catch the shape of it, though not enough to answer it, and the other half caught only the confidence in his voice and took that for proof. The bishop, a heavy, grave man with tired eyes, looked toward the Duke for his answer, and it was the Duke who turned instead and looked at Hester, standing a little apart with the register still held against her, and said nothing at all, only waited, the way he had told her once he preferred to wait for a thing to decide itself rather than seize it. She stepped forward. She did not curtsy to the bishop, and she did not look at Marchmont, and when she spoke in Latin herself, plain and clear enough to carry the length of the gallery, and translated her own words into English as she went, so that no one in the room, gentry or tenant, should be left to take Marchmont's confidence for truth a moment longer than it took her to correct it. My Lord Bishop, Mr. Marchmont has read you the rule aright. A marriage without the ordinary's licence is void from its beginning. He has not read you the register aright, and I have it here in my own hand to show you the difference. She opened the book to the page she had marked with a strip of ribbon that morning, and turned it so the bishop's clerk might follow her finger. The entry does not say sine licentia. It says licentia ordinarii accidente.
with the licence of the ordinary given.
The curate who wrote it named the licence in the margin, in the old fashion, and dated it 3 days before the marriage itself, which any clerk of your lordships may confirm against the diocesan rolls he has brought with him this morning, for I sent word a week since, asking that those very rolls be searched for that same date. The bishop's clerk, a thin, nervous man who had said nothing until that moment, began turning pages of his own book with a haste that drew every eye in the gallery, and found, after a silence that stretched long enough for a rook somewhere beyond the open windows to call twice, unanswered, the entry he was looking for, and read it aloud himself, in a voice gone suddenly loud with the strangeness of being the one, for once, to settle a matter of such size. "There is a licence," he said, "granted the 9th of April, that year, to a curate of Netherwell, for the marriage of 2 parties named as recorded. It is here, my lord. It has always been here." Marchmont's face did something Hester had not seen it do before, a stillness that was not composure, and he said, too quickly, that the register had plainly been altered, that a woman under suspicion of exactly such tampering could not be trusted to point out an entry that so conveniently answered his charge. "I have altered nothing," Hester said, and this time she did look at him. "And you know it, sir, because it was you who tried, 2 years since, to have this very book removed from the parish altogether, before ever I had charge of it, so that no one should be left to read what it plainly says. There is not the same as kind, sir. You taught me that yourself, in this same garden in March. I have only shown your own lesson back to you, in a language you did not think a curate's drudge would trouble to answer you in." There was a sound along the gallery wall that might, in a less solemn room, have been called laughter, quickly swallowed. The bishop looked at Marchmont a long moment, and then at the clerk's confirmed roll, and then closed the register himself, gently, the way a man closes a book he has finished with, and said that he saw no matter here requiring further hearing, that the marriage stood, and had always stood, and that he would be obliged if the parties present would allow him his dinner, which he had been promised an hour since. Marchmont left the gallery within the quarter hour, and did not stay for the dinner, and no one troubled to press him to. The Duke found her afterward in the garden, where she had gone to be alone with the smell of the cut grass and her own unsteady breath, now that there was no longer any need to keep it steady before a room full of strangers. "You did not have to answer him in Latin," he said. "English would have served." "English would have let half that room believe he had the better of me before ever the clerk found the roll," she said. "I wanted no one left believing a lie for want of my troubling to correct it. That is all it was." "That," he said, "is rather the point of view." And this time, when he almost smiled, he did not stop himself, and it stayed. He took her bare hand then, drawing the glove from it finger by finger with a care that made her breath catch worse than the whole ordeal in the gallery had, and pressed it, not to his mouth, but simply held between both of his own, warm and ink-stained, and not, for once, shaking at all. "I told you once I would rather have your no, freely given, than a yes you felt you owed me," he said. "I ask you now only because the choice is yours, to give or withhold exactly as you please, with nothing owed on either side. Will you have me, Hester Combe, knowing the whole of what I am and what I have concealed, and knowing I ask nothing of you in return but the same plain honesty you have never once failed to give me?" "Yes," she said. "It is the only word I need to give you back." The wedding was small, for a duke's,
held in the Netherwell Church itself, with Reverend Tilling, restored to his health enough to see the year out, reading the service in a voice that shook more from feeling than from age. Toby stood at the back with Mrs. Pruitt's hand on his shoulder, and swept the church steps himself that morning, though no one had asked it of him, and no one thought to stop him. Simon Marchmont was given, in the end, no worse punishment than the truth made public, and a small remote living in Cumberland to manage on the family's behalf, from which he was not asked, nor did he ask, to return. His bell-like laugh was not heard again in Netherwell.
A year later, on a winter evening much like the one that had begun it, Hester sat by the fire at Calder Hall, with the old register on the table beside her, its spine still held by her father's waxed thread inside its new calf binding, and her husband's bare hand found hers, without either of them remarking on it, the way it had come to do most evenings now, and did not let go. Toby read his letters by the same fire, slowly, proudly, from a primer the Duke had given him with no note attached, because he still did not care to be thanked for a kindness once it was done. Outside, once, a rook called, and was answered, and the fire held steady against the dark. It is not what a person says before the world that tells you who they are. It is only what they do when they believe the world is not looking at all.